The final paper of our first session this morning is by Thomas Smith. And Thomas is an actuarial science major, or have you switched to accounting?
No, I switched to accounting.
Switch to accounting. And if professors ever made money, might be able to use Thomas's services, but they surely would provide a practical necessity for somebody. Thomas's paper, unlike prior to, is on Plato's Apology of Socrates, and it's on the city of Athens versus Socrates. And Thomas wrote the paper. Did our first two speakers as a freshman, and he's a sophomore now. Thomas.
Thank you. With the power used to command nations, men can also destroy empires. Perhaps the greatest weapon one can use against others is the word of mouth. While a verbal attack does no physical harm, the indirect damage done to the victim is oftentimes undeniable. Today's social media is an accurate illustration of how words can have a lasting and sometimes permanent impact on the recipient. The statements made against the intended victim, whether or not they are true, become indelible scars that can take a lifetime or more to wash away. The use of words against others has existed since the development of human language. Spoken word has served humanity as both an essential tool and a dangerous weapon. During the trial of Socrates, as recounted by Plato in his Apology of Socrates, the use of words as a weapon against Socrates was intended to place him in a negative light and to convince the Athenian public that his philosophical beliefs were dangerous. The allegations of Socrates' accusers stemmed from their belief that Socrates did not believe in the same gods as the Athenians, but rather in strange daimonia. At the time, it was deemed intolerable in Athenian society for one to question the wisdom of government leaders, much less that of the gods from whom civic leaders took direction. Socrates, however, was a man who pushed beyond these social limitations and challenged various public figures, as well as the Oracle of Delphi, and by extension, Apollo himself. The end result was, of course, his execution and increased criticism of his philosophical beliefs. Though he never described himself as a teacher, Socrates often conversed with people in the marketplace about various subjects. In the process, the local youth gathered to listen to him. Although a traditional teacher-pupil relationship never existed between Socrates and these youth, it cannot be denied that the youth certainly learned from him. Socrates' influence on these developing minds, though unintended, had the powerful impact of instilling them with questions concerning the workings of nature and the existence of the gods. For the Athenians, these questions, being formed by the youth as a result of listening to Socrates, were viewed as dangerous to the stability of the Athenian society because the success of democracy depended on the cooperation of the majority, a majority that could be lost if too many youth became corrupted. Achieving such cooperation, at least in the eyes of his accusers, would be impossible as long as Socrates continued practicing philosophy, which meant that Socrates and philosophy in general would need to be removed. During his trial, Socrates made a point of distinguishing two different sets of accusers. The first set of accusers were comprised of those citizens of Athens who had slandered Socrates and his practices, many of whom became familiar with Socrates by seeing Aristophanes' comedy, The Clouds. The second set of accusers consisted of Miletus, Anytus, and Lycon, the Athenians who actually brought Socrates to trial. But it was the first group who Socrates believed to be more dangerous because they included the many nameless people who helped spread misinformation about Socrates over many years, who were themselves unaware that they were told falsities about Socrates or had simply misinterpreted Aristophanes' message in The Clouds. In contrast, the second set of accusers was focused primarily around the three men who brought the indictment against Socrates. Socrates suggested that the second set of accusers were victims themselves, noting that it was the persuasion over their minds during childhood, primarily from The Clouds and from the elders who had taken Aristophanes' message as fact rather than comedy, that led them to grow hateful towards Socrates' wrongdoing. Because the slander had gone on for so long, it can perhaps be considered that the accusers' wrongful beliefs about Socrates and philosophy would not deviate no matter the outcome of the trial. For this reason, Socrates is justified in considering the first accusers to be more dangerous, as the slandering would not cease once the trial had concluded and more people would see the clouds, which would only further the spread of misinformation, whereas the ones who indicted him would no longer have a case against him once the trial concluded. The charges made against Socrates concerned his philosophical beliefs and practices from throughout his life. Because he practiced these things his entire life, it could be said that Socrates lived for the advancement and understanding of philosophy. Therefore, the better question becomes whether Socrates was on trial for himself or for the fate of philosophy as a way of life, or both. Socrates recounted the accusations against him as such. Quote, Socrates does injustice and is a busybody, investigating the things beneath the earth and in the heavens, and in making the weaker speech the stronger, and teaching these things to others, unquote. Despite the absurdity, in his own opinion, of these accusations, he took care to divide these accusations into parts small enough to offer sufficient argument against. The first charge made against Socrates was that he does injustice and is a busybody. Part of the evidence against Socrates was a reference to the comedy of Aristophanes, The Clouds, where Socrates was portrayed as being able to perform remarkable feats such as walking on air and speaking of things about which he had no knowledge. These are likely the beliefs common to Athenians concerning all philosophers, but Aristophanes appeared to have projected the public's general beliefs directly onto Socrates, whom everyone knew. Also, one basis of philosophy is attempting to make sense of the big questions, which Aristophanes opposed out of fear of social instability. Moreover, contemplation about such major topics directly conflicted with the beliefs in the many gods of ancient Greece, who were credited with providing the knowledge needed by humans. Socrates made it clear that these first accusations were undoubtedly untrue, and called on those present at the trial to consider times when they had heard him teaching, so they would remember that he does not speak of subjects about which he is unknowledgeable. Socrates also makes it known that although he has no knowledge of the physical sciences, he has respect for those who study such subjects, because they are seeking to find knowledge in order to better understand the world. Personally, I agree with the way Socrates handles unfamiliar subjects, because pretending to possess knowledge only serves to make oneself appear foolish when confronted with uninformed conversation. In addressing the claims of being paid to teach, Socrates insisted that he is not associated with the sophists and does not collect money in exchange for his teachings, claiming it to be unjust to charge those wishing to learn and improve themselves if they are unwilling to pay. This is why he considered his instruction to be a form of public service, as he taught his pupils without payment and only in the interest of helping others. But because Socrates' judges did not agree with the value of his teachings, his proposed alternative punishment of being taken care of by the people was not considered, as he was not viewed as a public servant. Socrates is also criminalized for investigating things beneath the earth and in the heavens above. Socrates responded by claiming to have no interest in the physical sciences and that he does not speak of them, for he is unknowledgeable about such things. Despite this, he expressed respect for those who study such things, as they are seekers of truth, like Socrates himself, which he sees as virtuous, although he prefers to seek his own virtue in more philosophical ways. Curiously, there is no indication by those present at the trial that those who do study the physical sciences are similarly attempting to undermine the religious beliefs of the Athenian people. This is an indicator that the trial may well be based on something deeper, such as the public's hatred toward philosophy. Socrates was next accused for misusing rhetoric, thus making the weaker speech the stronger. While Socrates did not directly respond to this accusation, he did partially address this concern. In his opening statements, Socrates asked the court's forgiveness, as he did not possess the knowledge of the proper form of speaking in a trial. Socrates was, after all, 70 years old at the time of his trial. He mentioned that this trial was the first time in his life that he had been before a court, a fact that in itself should say something to the type of life he strived to live. And so it would seem understandable if he was not familiar with the customs in this setting. While he may not have knowledge of proper rhetoric in the courtroom, it is true that Socrates possessed strong rhetoric. The difference was that Socrates used rhetoric in a way that utilizes truth to support his claims, whereas others might rather appeal to others' sympathy to make their claims appear to be correct. For this reason, Socrates refused to call upon his friends to speak on his behalf, because their testimony would have been biased and likely contained emotional appeal. Socrates believed it to be unvirtuous to appeal to the judge's favor when it was their job to pass judgment according to the law rather than their own personal opinions. The final accusation made against Socrates by his first set of accusers was that he teaches others his dangerous ways. As mentioned before, the public concern seems to be focused on the youth that study under Socrates. This is a logical concern because people are at their most impressionable during their youth, which would, if the accusers were correct in their accusations, allow Socrates' teachings to be interpreted by the youth as truth, as they do not yet know better. Although Socrates could make a convincing counter-argument that allowing the youth to learn from their elders is just as dangerous by virtue of the Athenians not knowing the meaning of wisdom. But perhaps the most important part of Socrates' trial was when he began to answer the unasked question of whether the slanders against him originated. He went on explaining the time when he and Chaerephon, his companion and friend, ventured to Delphi, where Chaerephon inquired of the oracle whether there was anyone wiser than Socrates. In response, the Pythia reported that, quote, no one was wiser, unquote. Socrates was initially confused as to the meaning of the oracle, but came to interpret it as, quote, Socrates is the wisest, end quote. He decided to test the validity of the oracle's declaration by searching for someone who was wiser than himself. Socrates went to visit with politicians, poets, artisans, and others, only to discover that there was no man who was as wise as he claimed himself to be, which supported Socrates' interpretation of the oracle. Socrates was finally able to conclude that he was the wisest because he was able to admit that his wisdom was not all-encompassing and that there were some things about which he was ignorant. This was in contrast to the people with whom he spoke, who were viewed by the public to be genuinely wise, but, as Socrates discovered, were not wise even within their own professions. Socrates shared his feelings during his trial as a way of explaining the source of the slander made against him. However, this did not gain him the support of those present, some of whom had likely been people he had spoken with, although he mentioned no names of the people he spoke with, or were in league with those individuals. Socrates' explanation did help to explain where the slandering began, but at the same time it fueled the case against him, as it became clear that he was seeking a wise person simply to defy the wisdom of the oracle and, by extension, Apollo. There is one example of irony worth discussing after mentioning the oracle, that being the public response to Socrates' questioning of the oracle, which helped contribute to the accusations of blasphemy. Because Socrates had learned that there was no man worth his wisdom, it seemed foolish to him that the people of Athens put so much faith in the wisdom of the oracle at Delphi when they themselves did not know wisdom. This is a sensible observation. After all, how can people have faith in something they themselves do not know or understand? But then, this is the very essence of what it means to have faith. In other words, one could interpret that Socrates was questioning the existence of the gods and faith in general. Interpreted in this way, it quickly becomes clear why his teachings were seen as dangerous to the foundation of the Athenians' religious beliefs and the stability of the social order. In conclusion, it is clear that Socrates was more concerned with those who bought into the rumors and took Aristophanes at his word than with the men who simply brought him to trial. Socrates was right to place his fear in this way because the damage to his reputation by the word of mouth of the many would be more severe and more long-lasting than the indictment of the few. As it was in times of antiquity, so it remains today. There are many instances where the result of a legal case do not matter because broader public opinion of an individual is often more damaging to that person's reputation than the verdict or punishment made in a courtroom. These slanders spread by word of mouth travel very quickly across generations, and once the damage is done, there is almost nothing that can change it.
Thank you, Thomas. Comments or questions? And Alex Lemanowski has his hand up.
Yeah, so I've got one big question. You point out very, very well, I think, the role of reputation in courtrooms all over the world, and in particularly in the courtroom in question. But I want to know, Was Socrates guilty?
I think Socrates was guilty of defending what he believed in, and that he preferred to be punished for believing what he believed in rather than lying to himself and others that he didn't believe what he did in fact believe in, just to avoid punishment.
So does his guilt, the way you just described it, does his guilt align with what reputation claimed, what rumor said about him, or was the Aristophanic rumor overblown in some way?
I think it was Aristophanes and his personal opinions about what Socrates was saying, and that he took his own personal bias and put that into the comedy, which was of course a comedy and not to be taken directly as fact, but that the majority of people that did see it misunderstood that and took it as fact, and so that fueled the misunderstanding and then the subsequent hatred towards what Socrates was doing.
It's a very odd thing in the apology that he cares so much about the first set of accusers and claims that they're the most dangerous ones, despite the fact that they're not privy to this lawsuit and the punishment that can and will accrue, which involves his death. So he's going to be convicted, and therefore he's going to be upheld as being a criminal. The consequence of this. Is that not a slight against his reputation? Or is that not a slight to his reputation that he cares about? So is his view, it's okay to have a criminal record. That is concerns my reputation is fine, but this other thing that Aristophanes and others, they threatened his reputation, to use your term, in a way that troubles him. So why isn't he concerned about being deemed a criminal? And not that Andy is a criminal, but that Socrates would be deemed to be a criminal. And let me just add one thing to this to give it a little more weight. In my introduction to philosophy class this semester, I just finished teaching another one of Plato's dialogues called Meno. And the two pivotal characters are Meno, who's a would-be tyrant and is presented tacitly as engaged in criminal conduct and wants to engage in criminal conduct for his own well-being, wants to acquire as much as he can. And there's Socrates, who the dialogue takes place 4 years prior to the trial, about 403. Well, we know Socrates is going to be convicted, and he's going to be a criminal. So you have this dialogue between these two criminals, and the subject of the Meno is virtue. That's an odd juxtaposition. So let me simplify the question. Why is he concerned with his reputation being despoiled at the hands of Aristophanes, but not being despoiled at the hands of a guilty verdict?
So I think he's less concerned with the verdict in the courtroom because, I mean, like if you look at legal cases today, there's a lot of publicity right around the time of the verdict, but then not too long after, there isn't as much publicity anymore. And yes, the person may or may not carry that criminal record, but it's not as widely publicized. People don't make quite as much a big deal about it. Whereas if he were criminalized by this nameless group of mass people, that he might be walking through the marketplace, and every person is like, oh, there's Socrates, and he's a liar, and he talks about all these different crazy things about the gods and the way we should live and things like that.
So
So I enjoyed your paper a lot. I understood a lot of stuff about apology clearly. One of the parts that I wasn't sure about, though, was especially at the end, your characterization of Socrates' response to the oracle. So you suggest that his response to the oracle is a tacit, or could be understood as a tacit critique of faith or of religion. So I guess I wonder what you imagine the right response to that oracle to be, a response that on your reading would be less of a tacit critique of Athenian religion. I mean, because the oracle, I mean, is Socrates to sort of, is it time to go to the beach and sit back and say, oh, I'm done, no one's wiser, right? Oracle said so, time to sip a fruity drink and stop doing what I'm doing? Or, I mean, what would have been the pious response to that oracle if Socrates' response is somehow impious?
So I think the way that the Athenians, their belief system would be that if the oracle told him that he was wisest, that he would take it as that and not go any further. But because he's a seeker of truth and all his philosophy, that he, I guess he wanted to test that to be sure that he was in fact the wisest and not just take it at the word of the oracle.
The thing about oracles are that they're incredibly cryptic. I mean, that's just their nature. And so when one gets an oracle, it's typically not possible just to oh, there it is. One has to figure out what it means. So I wonder if there's any other way to find out what the oracle means other than engaging other people the way that Socrates does. That might not be a question.
For your next birthday, Charlie, I'm going to get you an oracle.
No, that's the last thing I want. Absolutely. I'd rather you get, I don't even want to say, but I'd rather you get me anything but an oracle.
Okay. Well, I'll give all of us Professor Berger.
Okay. I thought this was a great idea, the way you framed the whole dialogue, asking why does he spend so much time on the early charges? And you're right. I mean, it's so obvious in our own experience that public opinion is so powerful and influential. How does any legal verdict in a specific court case barely holds up to all the public opinion? And now with we don't know what to do with all the TV, trial and TV. So that was, I think, very good. We saw something that Plato was interested in. I think my big question is, let me ask my small question first. It struck me again, I'm not sure I remember this correctly when I would look back at it. It's interesting that the legal court accusation is the one that is about not believing in the gods of the city, the impiety charge. Actually, it's not explicit in the early charges. Right? The impiety charge belongs to the court case now. That's sort of interesting to me. I don't think I had given that enough thought before. Why that should be only explicit in the lit. Whereas it's probably, say it's implied by the charge that he investigates things above the heavens and beneath the earth, with the idea that the investigation of nature is bound to be impious or to put into question the role of the gods. But it's still very implicit. What interests me the most, I think, is you've got this focus on public opinions on. Let's not take for granted so quickly that the charges are all untrue, or that everything about them and on every interpretation they're false. I mean, perhaps the reason that Socrates spent so much time on it, under Plato's artful, representation, is that you said it at one point, you said these are the charges against philosophers as such, which Aristophanes then projected onto Socrates in particular. Right. Those charges show us the essential tension between the philosopher and the political community. That's what they really do emphasize. And certainly Plato has written his defense of Socrates, it's clear, right? We worship Socrates, he's the hero of the story, we blame the Athenians and so on. But yet he's managed at the same time to show us what the grounds are for this distrust of the philosopher from the point of view of society. And is there, I think he's raising the question, is there a solution to it? This might be a problem certainly without an easy solution. You want to also take into account the possibility that Plato, in writing this up, is suggesting that that in itself might be not a solution necessarily, but a way to handle the situation that Socrates got himself into by directly confronting the citizens. And in my mind, that's tied. This tie might not be so obvious, but we're talking about the interpretation of the oracle and what that means. And I think the way Professor Thomas put it is very helpful. It's not exactly that he's defying the oracle. In some sense, he's saying, wow, the oracle represents a god. It must be true. He sort of operates on this premise and then has to come up with a way of interpreting it that would merit divine authority. If it were a god and it were true, what could it mean, this cryptic statement? And this is a leap, I guess, that I make, but I wonder if it'll make sense to you. I think that Plato gives that to you as a model for interpreting any great work. That we have to assume there's some, if we have good reasons to make this assumption, like reading a Platonic dialogue that's lasted for thousands of years, not the latest journal article, maybe, but we should assume this guy is wiser, has got this wisdom, but what could he mean by this crazy statement, right? In a certain way, you have to construct it on your own. Socrates has to construct the meaning, and he says it's the core of his whole life, the source of his lifelong activity. So he constructed that, but actually on the premise, do you want to say this is pure rhetoric? I don't know, but on the premise that there was a divine wisdom behind this claim. Turns out to have a paradoxical interpretation that he has only human wisdom. I don't know does that make any sense?
Yeah, I think I got it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was going. I don't know if you mentioned who asked Chirophone, but we don't have why that oracle came about in the first place. Do you remember what the explanation of that was?
Remind us.
It's not there.
Yeah.
Exactly. So, but it's an odd thing to do. It wasn't the question about Socrates. So
Yeah.
someone went to the oracle to ask if Socrates is the wisest guy. So that cannot be the start of the troubles,
Right.
because he must have been doing something to precipitate that inquiry
Yeah.
from the oracle.
Yeah. I don't think Socrates went with him, by the way.
No, that's right, yeah. Chirophone went alone.
He leaves that in obscurity. Chirophone is someone, his brother, but he died. His brother's not here. He puts a bunch of layers between in order to make it very difficult to understand how it came about. Right.
And I would connect that, Professor McCuff, I would connect that with when he says, nobody heard me speaking about these investigations of nature. That's a very careful statement. The implication is he could well have been thinking or engaged in investigations of nature. He just didn't speak about it or teach it in any ordinary sense. So he was certainly doing something. And in a way that points to, I think, maybe a very central question that your paper is pointing to, and that is, philosophers were always in trouble, especially with the city, and impiety was always on the rise. We have this anecdote that Anaxagoras, this pre-Socratic who did study nature, had an impiety charge against him. So I think a big and important question to consider is, what was it about the Socratic political philosophic activity? What was it about Socratic political philosophy that brought this conflict so sharply to the fore?
I think what set Socrates aside was his method of teaching, where instead of simply preaching what he thought or what he believed, that he inspired his audience to think on their own and interpret what he was saying in their own way, and so to kind of inspire them to come up with their own ideas and understandings of different things, which could then, it opens the door to political instability.
Especially if you remember that, let's say his first group, the political men, right? He said they think they know something beautiful and good or important. So by putting their opinions in particular into question, maybe Anaxagoras didn't do that in any direct way, studying whether the moon is a rock or something. It doesn't really directly put any political views about the noble and good things into question. By doing that so directly, boy, was Socrates courting danger, right?
Ron, let me ask you a question with respect to this conversation with Thomas. So with these two sets of accusers, the first ones are held as being the slanderers. All the slander that they
Envy and slander.
envy and slander. Whereas the three men who are bringing Socrates to trial, they're not slanderers, which makes one focus on exactly what's being said about Socrates. And at 19b, Socrates says, well, let's see what the charge of the first set of accusers is. And then he says what the charge is. And he responds to that in some way. We don't need to go over the details. And then at 24b, after he's done with the first set of accusers, at
Right.
least explicitly in terms of the narrative presentation, and he gets to the second set of accusers, he says, well, let's get to this one statement. It's something like this. So where there's not really a charge, with the first set of accusers, he presents it as a charge, and exactly as the charge is. And when it comes to the second set of accusers, who have these charges,
They're written down.
that's a sworn statement, and there's no doubt, and it would have been very explicitly presented in the courtroom. Socrates doesn't say, well, it's this, it's something like this. And that's a curious juxtaposition. You think, just as you believe, and this is, I think, the high point of Thomas's paper, and really great insight, it's the first set of accusers that provide the real business of the dialogue, not the second, but it would look like it's the second.
Yeah.
And if you'd ask, well, where is the sworn statement to be found? It would have to be found amongst those who really presented a sworn statement and came into court, and, you know, here it is.
Yeah.
But it's not, it's the first set.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. Okay, so he doesn't believe in the gods that the city believes in. Something like that is the current charge. So two things. One is he gives no argument ever against the charge.
The second set.
Right.
That's right.
He has no defense against it. I mean, there's no way you can walk away from this dialogue without concluding that Socrates is guilty as charged. He does not believe in the gods that the city believes in, as the city believes in.
But that's just,
So-
again, guilty is charged of, the legal charge is the indictment filed against him by the
Exactly.
case itself.
So, he doesn't have a defense against it, and therefore you draw your conclusion from that. But I also think that somehow, he goes, something like this, or somehow they say the following. That little adverb there is the wedge, which allows Socrates to, what he does do very powerfully, I think, and very persuasively, is show that the accusers don't know what they're talking about. Miletus doesn't know if he's really charging him with not believing in gods at all, or not, whatever the difference, then you're forced by Plato to think what the difference is between those two issues, right? Or not believing in the gods of the city. But that somehow is so interesting. It's Socrates' wedge into exploiting. He makes it ambiguous in order to exploit the charge. That's how I would put it. I think he does that well.
Yeah, getting back to this distinction between the old accusers and the new accusers on this point, what it suggests is that he doesn't have very much respect for the new accusers.
Yeah.
None. Contempt, really. That he doesn't even merit their accusation with a quotation, with specificity. So that does, it suggests two things. One, maybe, it's very speculative, maybe he does in a certain sense merit Aristophanes or those who have these reputational accusations against him, even though he wants to rebut them. So that's one thing to suggest. The other thing it suggests is that going back to Professor Warner's question, is that he's much more worried about his reputation vis-a-vis anybody who's swayed by the old accusations than he is worried about the new accusers or the new accusations, which means he's not worried about being convicted, right? So this suggests that that whatever it is that he is taking seriously, he's over and over again making it clear that what he's not taking seriously are Miletus and Lycomanitis or their accusations. And it's like intentionally not learning someone's name, right? You know, it's just rude and it's demeaning and it shows contempt. He's intentionally not crediting their charge with a quotation. And then he's showing in cross-examination or interview that they don't even know what it is. It's just contempt. So he's proving himself guilty of the explicit charge, which shows that's not what he's worried about at all.
But in which case, you're right about that, then, and this further substantiates the thrust of Thomas's paper, then the argument of Aristophanes against Socrates' reputation, well, what do we say? It has some merit to it. It's meritorious enough to consider it, but then the question would be, what's meritorious about it?
One last thing you might want to think about is it has been said that Aristophanes actually accurately captured the young Socrates, and Socrates made a turn, as he tells us in his own autobiography. On the last day of his life, he made a turn and so that would really credit Aristophanes. That would mean Aristophanes was the one who alerted Socrates to something he needed to do in his practice of philosophy that he had. It's really crediting if that argument can be supported, it's crediting Aristophanes with a lot. He was really responsible influence for the Socratic turn that gave us Socratic political philosophy.
Thomas, thank you very much.